All right, everybody. We're going to talk about Haunting Ground. We just beat it here on stream, and whenever we beat a game, I like to talk about it from a mechanical standpoint, a story standpoint, and then an overall standpoint. And this game was really interesting. So mechanically, it does some things that kind of separate it from the the normal thing you would expect from survival horror. It still has some of those tropes, but it doesn't engage with them in the same way. So mechanically, there is no health essentially. You have your what is it called? Panic meter, right? You have how much you're panicking, and then you have your stamina, which is how much you can run. Right, those are the two things. Now, those gauges are invisible. You don't see those gauges anywhere. It's all shown through the animation of the character. The stamina you can see subtly. If you run enough, she'll start like holding and like limping, and then if you give her time, you'll actually see her arm slowly move back down to her side until she's got full stamina again, which I think is a really, really cool way of doing that. In the panic system, the screen starts to kind of blur and discolor until you get into full panic mode. When you get into full panic mode, basically she is forced to run. You cannot stop her. And you just kind of have to direct her until the full panic mode goes down. If she falls, she could be potentially set up for a kill from one of the stalkers, which we'll talk about that mechanic here in a little bit. But it's interesting that there's not a like health bar per se, and the panic once you're like if you do fall on the ground or after a certain amount of time, it will wear off. And then you get put at like I would say like 75% panic, and then you can use items. Now when you're in full panic, you can't use anything, so that's why again you're very very much set up to be executed essentially. But so that's kind of a little bit of a difference. But there are items in the game that you can find and craft that will allow you to keep your panic low, keep your stamina up. I will say the crafting system, to mention it here, is my least favorite thing of the game. It's completely optional to deal with. They do tend to give you enough items to, it feels like, to deal with that stuff. But you do also get a lot of medallions, which is what you use in the process of creating stuff. But the system itself is just, it basically what it is there's a bowl that rotates or rotates through colors. The problem is it rotates very, very quickly. It's like white, green, blue, white, green, blue. Like it rotates very quickly. And if you're too early, like if you see just a sliver of it, you get nothing. And if you do it too late, where there's a sliver left on the other side, you get nothing. So you have to do it when the color's up there. And again, this thing is going rotate, 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 rotate. And you have to do that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like 8 or 9 times, right? And if you somehow get good at it, you can get like things that completely wipe out your panic, completely refill your stamina. You also get stuff that helps Huey out in the stamina department as well, which leads me into the next mechanic, Huey. Huey is our German Shepherd companion for the game, and you start out the game not with Huey. You end up he ends up helping you, you end up helping him, and eventually you team up together, and he's kind of your main way of keeping threats at bay while also keeping yourself alive. You can kick in the game. There is like an attack essentially, which changes per costume. We found out that there's a cowgirl costume which gives you a gun, and there's a BDSM outfit which gives you a little whip kind of thing. But most of the time you're going to be using the kick, obviously. And the kick is kind of your damage. Outside of some items that you find, there's items that you can do that set traps, and if they step over it, it does damage. And then there's items that you can throw that will, when it hits them, it kind of explodes and does damage as well. And you can use those to kind of slow down or debilitate the stalkers as they're coming after you. Basically, every stalker has a boss fight, so there is a way where you get rid of them eventually, but that leads us into the stalker mechanic, which is basically from the beginning of the game, some person is trying to get Fiona, which is our main character. And we go through essentially 4 stalkers that all want to get Fiona for different reasons. And then they get their own boss fight with their own mechanics, but the mechanics always are within the confines of the game. One boss you deal with by kicking / letting them destroy stuff. Another boss is just pushing stuff, so getting Huey to distract them so you can push stuff. Another boss is breaking, using a kick to break a wall, and then using commands for Huey to jump and kick that guy off of a wall. And the final one is using both the kick and the Huey distraction method to essentially get the boss to like run into fire or run into fans and stuff like that. I don't want to, you know, spoil who's what, but it'll be obvious when you get there. But outside of those boss fights, the stalkers basically are the things that keep you from progressing, right? You'll go into an area, you're like, okay, I need to pick up this item. Oh, but there's a stalker coming after me, and then you have to find a hiding spot. You can do this by crouching behind something. If they didn't see you, you can do this by finding actual hiding spots like closets, under tables, under couches, under beds. So a lot of that. Now, if you use the same spot multiple times, they will eventually figure it out, and they will be like, hey, I see you under there. And then you have to come out and find a different spot, essentially. Again, you can use Huey as a distraction to basically be like, okay, stop right there. I'm going to run around, use a hiding spot, and then you won't find me, right? Huey is basically the most important mechanic of the game. Getting Huey to distract, attack, and acquire items and stuff like that. We've had you in a box, that's fine. But he basically is just how you engage with what would be the combat of the game, essentially. So getting used to how to issue commands, it's not very hard. We play this on PS2, so you just use the right joystick. Up tells Huey to go. If you're looking at an enemy, that means like go attack that enemy. You have left, which I know I'm pushing right, but you know the controller is supposed to be like this. But left will tell Huey to that's your scold. So telling, you know, bad Huey. That's what that means. To the right is good Huey. That's your praise. Down is your come here, which is the one command that doesn't work as often as I'd like. I don't know if you have to be looking at Huey to get him to come to you, or if you could just generally say it. It's a little finicky for that. Most of the other commands are pretty like on point. Once you give a command, he'll try to engage with that. And then if you click the stick in, that will get Huey to sit and stay. Which is important because there's a number of puzzles in the game that require Huey to stay in a location, essentially. Which, of course, leads us into our final mechanic. As most survival horrors, this game has puzzles. I will say none of these puzzles are particularly difficult. Some of them are just a little tedious, but none of them are really particularly difficult. Which I think is fine, because I think overall, mechanically speaking, this is probably, I would argue, now there is a hard mode, so I'm just talking about a normal playthrough here, but I think this is probably one of the easiest survival horror games I've played. They are very kind with how much save points they place, where they place them. Like, they make it very obvious, like, hey, you should save here before going to that door, like, 2 steps away, just in case, you know. And there is a final sequence where you can save before the final sequence hits. So they give you a save, right? So you never feel like, oh god, I got to do 7 hours of running around and stuff again. So they're very kind with the saves. But like mechanically speaking, I think this is the easiest one I've played. But I think that goes to its benefit because I think it also makes it the most accessible. We'll talk about that more in the overview. But let's get to the story. So the story is about our protagonist, Fiona. She is in a car accident and she's essentially abducted, taken to this castle, and this castle is filled with a bevy of enemies that all want Fiona for some purpose. Each stalker has their own reason for Fiona, although I will say 3 of the 4 stalkers are basically all connected by their want for some relation to womanhood. Now, one stalker is wanting to become a complete woman, as she puts it, Daniela, by potentially stealing what is never. It's only referenced like once or twice. That's essentially her womb, her ability to feel anything and also bear children. And that is basically kind of similar to the other 2, Ricardo and Lorenzo, who want to seek immortality through basically rebirth. But by rebirth, they mean literal rebirth, like as in being born from Fiona. So there's a lot in this story that's about kind of how people depersonalize women in a way to where they simplify their identity to their ability to conceive children or just conceive in general. And that narrative is pushed through the entire story with how people talk, how people act, the things you read. Everything is pointing towards basically seeing Fiona, or at least the stalkers and the antagonists, seeing Fiona not as a person, but as her ability to conceive. Now, they call it Azoth is her energy, but at the very beginning of the game, there is a statue that's revealed, by which we don't find out till later is Lorenzo, that says, "This is your future." And it's just basically a statue of, or a clay sculpture of a pregnant woman, right? And so they tell you right off the bat kind of the things that the stalkers are wanting on a basic scale. The only one that really stands out from all of that is Diabilitas. Now it is shown that Diabilitas probably has some mental issues, probably some learning disabilities, some like understanding, also not being taught properly, not being engaged properly. So he kind of falls into that trope of the kind of like the uneducated brute, or the mentally disabled brute. But this game came out in 2005, so that trope was, pretty common around that time. But his like point of chasing Fiona is actually not related to any of that, which is really interesting, because when you're being chased by Diabilitas, he specifically says Dolly. So his entire intention with Fiona is just to play with her, at least based on my interpretation. The problem is Diabilitas is also, like 6'8" and like built like a brick wall. So his version of playing can be very, very dangerous to another human being. And the reason why it's obvious that that's kind of the case is because there's a scene where Diabilitas closes a door behind him with Fiona on the, she's like, on the ground, and he goes, "Rah!" and like looks at her. And rah, because he's getting a reaction from her, which is not something he gets from his dolls. And he does drop a doll. There is a doll you can pick up. I think it's called a Bisque doll. That says it's Diabilitas's doll. I think it's meant as a distraction. You can like throw it, and then he's like, "Ooh, I'll take the dolly," that kind of thing. But Diabilitas, I think, is the most innocent of the stalkers, because his intentions has nothing to do with her, like Azoth and womb and motherhood and stuff like that. His is just, he wants a playmate that isn't a doll that's this big, and that's just kind of his entire incentive in like chasing her and stuff. Now, when you die to a stalker, they each have their own like unique sounds, and there is an argument to be made that there is some weird like squishing sounds when Diabilitas does catch you and kill you. But I think that's from, again, him being so big and not understanding that he can't be rough with things. So he ends up essentially crushing Fiona, is my belief on that. Now, what's interesting is Diabilitas is also a little bit of a spoiler here. As far as I know, the only character you don't have to kill. You can, based on what I know, but you don't have to kill Diabilitas. If you do his boss fight a certain way, he survives, but then he realizes Fiona is a person, not a doll, and goes about his way, and we don't see him again until the end of what I'm assuming is the good ending, where he just starts tending to the garden. But what's interesting is all the stalkers, they kind of evolve over their stalking pattern, which is another cool thing story-wise, because it's the whole like adapt to what's happening with your object of obsession. And I'll be perfectly clear, that's exactly how they see Fiona, is as an object. It's her Azoth, it's her womb, it's her ability to procreate. They do not see Fiona as a person. And again, that's kind of the narrative that's pushed there. And again, it's I was talking about it during the playthrough, which if you want to catch the playthrough, obviously that'll all be up here on the YouTube channel. Is the conversation that this brings up about people being basically their entire identity being condensed down to the idea of whether or not they can give birth, is still a discussion that we are avidly fighting here in 2024. And this game came out in 2005, so it's almost 2 decades ago they were having this conversation, and we're still having this conversation. So I think it's an important one to have, because there's a perspective thing that obviously all these stalkers are missing. But each of them evolve in an interesting way. And Diabilitas I think is one of the most interesting, because when he's chasing you at first, he calls you Dolly. But when you get into his fight, and I'm not sure if he does this before, but I know when you get into his boss fight, he stops saying Dolly and starts saying Fiona. So he's actually sounding out her name, which, again, up to this point, as far as I know, he never used. So you could tell that he's trying, even he's adapting to Fiona, but it's because, again, if you do his boss fight the way that we did it, he survives, but he sees her as a person, no longer a doll, right? And that's why he has a respect for her personhood, or at least it seems to have a respect for her personhood, and just leaves. So it's interesting. I think there's a lot of commentary here to kind of discuss on a deeper level, and I think it's worth discussing. Because again, we're having some of these same discussions in 2024, and I think they're very important discussions to have, because reducing people to one facet of who they are and saying that's all they are is not only harmful and malicious, it's also very dangerous. Because essentially you're removing their personhood from them. You're like, oh, I don't see you as a person. I see you as a pair of shoes, right? Or the money that you make, or stuff like that. You're rejecting who they are as a person and just accepting that they are only this facet. And people are multifaceted, obviously. But if you can't tell, I love this story. I think it's really well told. I think the way that the stalkers react and stuff is just really good, that they all adapt in a certain way, and all of them still make sense in context. I could honestly talk about the story and the depth and the characters probably for hours, honestly, because I feel like there's little nuances with everything. But we're going to kind of summarize this up. So for an overview, basically, my major gripes with the game are, I do not like the alchemy minigame. I think it is the worst part of the game. It is optional, but it is very helpful because it does give you the chance to get more resources. So really, really don't like the alchemy minigame. The second thing is the stalkers can become a bit tedious. And that tedium, especially when you're already lost, already trying to figure out puzzles, like, it could definitely grind you down a little bit. I feel And I think that might be one thing that kind of pushes some people away is like, oh god, here comes Diabilitas for the 7th time. It's like, I just want to go through the door. And there were sequences where that happened, where Diabilitas was literally like scoping the 3 screens that we needed to interact with. So it's one of those that, like, it can get a bit grating, and I do think that that will probably push some people away from the game. But overall, I really, really enjoy the game. I like how it's designed. I like how the audio works. I like how the story is portrayed both through animations, but also through the story itself, the interactions, the voiceover. And the voiceover is actually really good, and just it does a good job of making these people seem absolutely insane, especially by the end when you start getting into fights with them. Huey, although can be a little mechanically, like, a little annoying to deal with sometimes because he doesn't always listen to commands. And we did get we got the dog lover level, so we got, like, I'm guessing the best like Huey level. So he listened to us like 90% of the time. It's just sometimes I couldn't tell if it was because the way I issued the order or the direction I was facing or something like that that caused some, like, misconnection. So it's not the perfect companion system, but it's a pretty darn good one, honestly. It's a pretty darn good one. But my recommendation is, if you can play Haunting Ground, whether that's through emulation or somehow a physical copy or whatever, I do recommend it. Like I said, it's got some caveats of the stalkers can be a little grating, and the alchemy minigame can be very annoying, and sometimes Huey doesn't listen. But overall, I think this is probably one of the most approachable survival horror games I've ever played. Because without there being a health system, without there being some sort of real hardcore resource management like you do get with other survival horror games, I do feel like people could play this that haven't played survival horror games and probably still have a pretty good time. And that's really strange to say that this one is the most accessible given, you know, the years of survival horror, but I really do truly believe that. I think Haunted Ground might be, at least so far as I've played, the most accessible survival horror game. So I will say also, at the time of recording, a physical copy, if you want complete, which comes with the manual and the, you know, the OG case and stuff like this is $400. So if you're an avid collector, if you're like me and you want to focus on preservation, which always preservation first, please, I don't know if Capcom will ever see this, but Capcom, if you do, please give us ports of this. You've already ported Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 to GOG. Give us the Haunting Ground port. I don't need a remake. I don't need a remaster. Just port the game so people can play these awesome games. And I think it's worth your time. But if you don't have $400 laying around to throw at it, or that's just too much for a game or whatever, I bought it when it was cheaper than that, to be clear. It's just the prices go up and down with retro games. Emulation for now will be the best way to play a lot of these survival horror games, because their prices are just really, really high. And it's unfortunate, because I do think that there's a lot of these games that I think are worth playing. So hopefully, fingers crossed, if Capcom gets enough badgering from the community, maybe we'll finally get a Haunting Ground port. But until then, emulate the game, enjoy the game. Tell me what you think down in the comments, because this one's really interesting, and I think it might be become one of my new favorite survival horror games, just because of how easy it is to play, but how deep the story gets. It's basically like if you played like a Silent Hill on easy without combat, and it was just focused on story and puzzles. Like, that's basically Haunting Ground. And it just does those things so well. And I really enjoyed it. And I hope you guys enjoyed the playthrough if you watched it. If you haven't, it is down here on YouTube. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Again, if you've played the game, talk to us about it in the comments. If you haven't played the game, do you intend to play the game now? Or is it just something that's a far-off dream? Either way, I will catch you in the next review. Bye-bye.